A single Ukrainian general looked at the map, saw 50 Russian tanks and hundreds of soldiers advancing, and gave just one order: we hit them before they dig in. Less than an hour later, the convoy was gone, vehicles burning and soldiers fleeing. This wasn't artillery, and it wasn't an army the size of Russia's. It was drones, cheaper than a Russian helmet, and soldiers on motorcycles. What happened between that moment and total Russian collapse is the kind of battlefield turn you'll never forget. Before we move on, I will like you to subscribe to the channel and like the video. At 6:15 a.m., the monitors in Ukraine's Dnipro Operations Center flared with solid blocks of white on a black field. To the trained eyes in the underground bunker, those shapes were not harmless patterns. They were the thermal outlines of T-90M main battle tanks, followed by BMP-3 infantry carriers, moving 3 columns wide and keeping perfect interval as they pushed west. The long-range UAV feeding the images was circling more than 12 kilometers ahead of the front line, its thermal optics sharp enough to pick out the exhaust haze from each idling engine. Every frame was fed down a secure link, decrypted, and displayed on a wall-sized screen, so the staff could watch the armor advance in real time. Within minutes, ground scanners confirmed over 100 vehicles, with the largest heat signatures toward the middle of the mass. Heavy haulers, pulling supplies. Operators began tagging each target: red markers for armor, orange for transports, yellow for command vehicles fanning out along the convoy. Analysts studying the satellite corroboration noted something more troubling than the numbers: trailers stacked with fuel barrels and pallets of ammunition rolling under minimal escort. That much fuel and ordnance meant Russia was not just probing for weakness, it was bringing resources to establish a forward base capable of sustaining a 10-day offensive without resupply. If those vehicles reached their staging point intact, Ukrainian defenders would face a constant barrage from entrenched artillery with secure armored support. In Moscow, planners had expected local Ukrainian defenses to collapse well before such a formation reached resistance. The convoy itself was part of that projection, a moving show of mass meant to signal inevitability. From the Kremlin's point of view, this was an unstoppable advance, built on overwhelming tonnage and firepower. In the Dnipro command tent, the same columns looked less like an army and more like a rare opportunity, the kind you act on before it disappears. General Havlenko didn't hesitate. He ordered an immediate strike before crews could cut the engines, start digging, and put their armor into hull-down defensive positions. The challenge was asymmetry. Ukraine could not match tank for tank, but it did not need to. On the targeting list were small quadcopters and fixed-wing drones with a unit cost under $4,000, a fraction of the millions sunk into each Russian vehicle. The gap in expense was not just economic. It meant Ukraine could deploy dozens of attack assets for the cost of a single tank tread. A moving convoy is far more vulnerable than a dug-in force. Exposed flanks, predictable pacing, open decks carrying combustible loads. Seen from above, those vulnerabilities formed a checklist. Phase 1 would exploit them. Operators launched swarms of loitering munitions, each programmed to dive on a specific segment of the convoy, breaking apart the spacing and forcing vehicles into stop-and-go chaos. The UAV above relayed an unbroken panorama, marking targets in sequence so attacks could move from front to rear without overlap or confusion. Orange blips in the middle of the column, the fuel trucks, got priority pairing with drones fit with high explosive charges. Red markers on the flanks marked where heavier warheads were needed to disable main guns and engine bays. For the Ukrainian teams watching, this view was priceless. No Russian commander had access to such a complete overhead map, and no one on the ground knew their exact place in a kill list that was already unfolding. Columns were still moving when the first detonations ripped through their lead elements, sending shock through the formation. But from that instant forward, the drones were only the opening act. What followed was audible before it was visible, and it came on 2 wheels. When the first detonations rolled through the convoy, Russian crews braced for the familiar rhythm of incoming artillery. Instead, through the smoke, another sound threaded closer. A rapid, higher-pitched growl. It wasn't tanks advancing or armored personnel carriers repositioning. It was the whine of multiple small motorcycle engines, growing sharper with every second, bad terrain or not. The noise moved fast, darting in from opposite flanks, low to the ground and hard to track through gun sights designed for larger, slower targets. Motorcycles weren't chosen for style. They could thread between hedgerows where tracked armor would bog down, climb embankments at angles no wheeled troop carrier could manage, and run on fuel loads small enough to be staged and hidden in scattered caches. They could cross bridges too weak for tanks and bypass craters that would halt heavier vehicles. Every kilogram saved in transport meant more ammunition carried by the rider and less dependence on vulnerable supply lines. And in open country, their acceleration outstripped anything Russia had rolling at that moment. From the Russian perspective, a 250cc or 450cc bike charging toward a main battle tank had the look of a suicide run. For the riders, this was calculated leverage. Strapped across their backs, clipped to frames, or mounted inside panniers were anti-armor systems selected for the exact targets ahead. The first wave carried RPG-26 launchers, lightweight one-shot weapons good for striking at thinner armor on flanks and rear plates. The second had shoulder-fired Malutap systems tailored to disable lighter armored transports or breach side skirts on heavier ones. The third leaned on Barrier V missiles, a guided system with the punch to defeat frontal armor if the angle was right. The convoy's point vehicle, a T-90M, became the test case. Wing 1 split as it approached, two bikes veering wide, while one rider held direct course. Guided by overhead drones relaying every movement, the riders timed their swerve to hit the tank's starboard side from two angles. One RPG fired mid-stride, the warhead punching straight into the engine block area, stopping the 46-ton tank cold. Before the crew could recover, the other bikes were already accelerating out of range to switch position for another pass. Drones overhead warned of turrets traversing toward the sound of retreating engines, and seconds later, flagged openings elsewhere in the line. This precision data meant motorcycle teams weren't blindly engaging. They were interceptors, riding exactly where exposed armor or critical cargo was waiting. Wing 2 sliced into the middle of the column under cover of new drone strikes, hitting two BMP-3s and dropping their troop payloads into disarray on the roadside. At the tail end, Wing 3 executed their role with near-clinical timing. They struck the convoy's fuel haulers and one ammunition carrier within minutes of each other. Drone footage later showed the fireball blooming high enough to silhouette the retreating bikes. The rear vehicles jammed together in panic, boxed in by disabled carriers, while the front was still reeling from the sudden disappearance of its spearhead. Less than a quarter of an hour from the moment the motorcycles broke cover, the statistics told their own story. 21 armored vehicles knocked out, over 100 Russian personnel dead or incapacitated, all without Ukrainian forces fielding a single tank. The kill ratio favored speed, coordination, and precision, every advantage flowing from lighter, faster assets, exploiting gaps before the enemy could form a coherent defense. And as the last of the motorcycles circled back behind friendly lines, other crews were already moving into place, sighting in from static positions. Mortars began thumping in the distance, tightening what had become a shrinking pocket of fire and wreckage. That morning proved that heavy armor counts for little when the enemy is faster, harder to track, and armed with precision. Convoy tactics built on mass and intimidation collapsed under waves of low-cost drones and riders who could strike and vanish in minutes. Traditional battle lines broke before they could even form. Speed and coordination erased Russia's numerical advantage faster than any artillery barrage. If units like these can dismantle a reinforced column in under an hour, what does that mean for future war plans? Subscribe and follow, because the next evolution of battlefield strategy is already taking shape.